The abundance of these phytoplankton are going to vary with locations. You're going to see that some phytoplankton are dominant in other locations. For example, find more diatoms in cooler water. Basically, phytoplankton distribution, though, is going to correspond to nutrient distribution in the water. So remember, nutrients are important in terms of primary productivity, and the phytoplankton are your primary producers. So where nutrient levels are higher, typically close to the coastlines, as well as in more northern and southerly parts of the ocean in cooler water, this is where we're going to see the greater amount of phytoplanktons living. A reason why we see a concentration of primary producers along sort of the outer edges or the margins of the ocean basins is due to something called coastal upwelling. Coastal upwelling is important because it helps to bring nutrients that help fuel that primary productivity. And once again, we want enough nutrients, but not too many nutrients that we have eutrophication occurring or harmful algal blooms occurring. What is happening here? How does coastal upwelling occur? Well, once again, we have wind blowing parallel to the coast. If you remember about Ekman transport, that's going to cause water to move off shoreline. And that water, as it moves off shoreline, we're going to have underlying nutrient-rich water that's going to come up and replace the colder or the warmer water that's moving away from the coast. So you have colder, more nutrient-rich water replacing the surface water that's being moved away from the coastline as a result of Ekman transport. And that upwelling brings up these nutrients, which are essential to productivity. With an increase in nutrient levels, which then drives an increase in productivity, primary productivity, we then get an increase in all other sorts of life within the ocean. So areas where we see coastal upwelling, very productive. We see an increase in number of fish stocks and other larger marine organisms. More nutrients means greater productivity, means greater amounts of life, greater diversity within that part of the ocean. We're now going to look at some other primary producers. We're going to look at marine plants, specifically marine angiosperms, which is a true plant. And we're also going to look at marine algae, macroscopic algae, so algae that we're able to see with our naked eye. Algae appear very plant-like, but they're not a true plant. Here's the basic body plan of an algae. Once again, macroscopic means we can see with our naked eye. So it looks very plant-like. It has a lot of structures that are very similar to in plants, but they're not plants. They don't contain vascular tissue. And the vascular tissue is material that lets fluids flow up and down or throughout a plant. So if you look at this right here, we see that the body of this macroscopic algae, known as a thallus, it contains some very common components, or components that look very common or very similar to what we see within a plant. There's a holdfast. This is at the bottom. The holdfast looks like a root, but it's not a root, but it helps anchor the thallus to the sea floor. We don't obtain nutrients through the holdfast. It's basically there just to hold the rest of the macroscopic algae in place. So it's going to need a rock or some hard sediment, maybe a shipwreck or something to anchor that macroscopic algae to. We also have stipe. A stipe might be thought of as sort of similar to a plant stalk. That prevents sort of a framework of support for the rest of the algae. We have fronds. Fronds are leaf-like or blade-like attachment. This is where we see photosynthesis occurring. This is where nutrients can be taken up. And then we have these gas bladders, and these actually filled with gas, and they kind of help hold this whole entire macroscopic algae within the water column. Here are some examples of what these structures look like in real life. So on the left-hand side, we see some fronds and gas bladders. On the right-hand side, we have the holdfast. And once again, I've just put the definitions there on the slide so you can refer to them and take a look at what is being shown in the slide. This macroscopic algae is commonly known by another name, seaweed. Here I have seaweed in sort of like air quotes, unicellular, multicellular algae. But remember, they're not plants. They look like plants. Calling them seaweed kind of infers or gives the inference that they're plants, but they're not true plants. But still, they photosynthesize. We see a huge diversity in the size of them and the shape. You can have very small macroscopic algae plants, very large ones, reach up to 45 meters in length. The shape. The important thing is to remember as well is why are they not a plant? Because they lack vascular tissue. They're non-vascular organisms. We're only ever going to see them growing in the euphotic zone. They need that sunlight. They need to be able to photosynthesize, and they do wonderfully in shallow water. That's where they thrive. Warm, shallow water, even cold, shallow water, lots of nutrients. There are some limiting factors that will control where they can live. Once again, water temperature. Some species like warmer water, some like colder water. How much nutrients are available, low nutrient supply. Your macroscopic algae might not do that well, as well as the substrate. Remember, they have that hold fast, so they need to be able to anchor themselves to something. Otherwise, they just float away, and that's not good if you're a seaweed or a macroscopic algae. Finally, we see many different types, and we can classify them based on the color of their fronds. Finally, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in Module 12, you'll see that seaweed, once again I'm using air quotes here, can be used for a variety of industrial purposes. It can show up in toothpaste, it can show up in ice cream, it can show up in a whole bunch of other unexpected places. Here are two types of seaweed or macroscopic algae. Once again, the classification is based on color. We have green, red, or brown macroscopic algae. The brown is known as kelp. Here, for example, we have green seaweed. And once again, not technically a plant, but I'm going to call it seaweed. The name for this is chlorophyta, green. This is something that's known as man's fingers. On the right, we have red seaweed, also known as rotophyta. And red because of the presence of a pigment that reflects red light and absorbs blue light. The presence of this red pigment, interestingly enough, allows this organism to photosynthesize and live at greater depths than most other algae. We also have brown seaweed, quite commonly known as kelp, or another type here that we have called rockweed. We typically see brown algae in northern hemisphere waters where it might be a little bit colder, and they exist in a wide range of sizes and forms, clearly seen in these two diagrams. Here we have this really small, you can hold it in your hand, brown seaweed, the rockweed, and then to the right there we have kelp. And the kelp actually can form these large, basically underwater forests of kelp. Another picture of brown seaweed or kelp. Here, this is known as giant kelp. It can grow up to 45 meters in length in one growing season. And it's one of the fastest growing organisms on the planet. They can grow at a rate of about 60 centimeters a day. And in temperate waters, such as off the coast of California, what we see is this kelp can form these large, basically, as I said before, underwater kelp forests, which provide really valuable habitats for a variety of different species. Marine angiosperms are another type of primary producer, and these are true marine plants. So these are plants that reproduce via flowers or seeds and include seagrasses and mangroves. We can describe them as being autotrophic, vascular plants, so they have tissue that fluids can flow through within the structure of the plant, and they can be either hydrophytes or macrophytes. Hydrophyte means it's a plant that only grows in or near the water, or on the water, sorry. Macrophytes is a plant, especially an aquatic plant, that's large enough to be seen by the naked eye. So right here you have some examples of Thalassia on this image, marine seagrass. This is both a macrophyte, large enough to see with our naked eye, as well as a hydrophyte, and autotrophic as well. Here are some seagrasses. Once again, a flowering plant. In the sort of inset photo, you can see one of the flowers that they do produce. The leaves typically are long and narrow. They're limited to growing in the photic zone, the euphotic zone, submerged, and we typically find them in shallow or sheltered coastal waters where the bottom tends to be very fine-grained sand or mud. These are quite often called foundation plant species because they can either modify the environment or they can create a unique habitat, and very small young juvenile fish and other marine organisms quite often start off their lives within the grasses, within sort of the leaves of these seagrasses. They're protected from many other things, difficult for predators to find them. Just like grasses on land, seagrasses have leaves, they have flowers, they have roots, and they have a rhizome. And this map just gives you an idea of the global distribution of seagrasses. We don't see them in more northern areas, so definitely nowhere near the South Pole or the North Pole. We see them concentrated more in the tropical and subtropical regions. Some areas we have up to 15 species present. Some areas we only see 1 or 2 different species of seagrasses present. Another example of marine angiosperms are mangroves. Here we have a picture of a mangrove here. They can be shrub-like or form trees. They typically are found growing in coastal communities, once again in more tropical settings, and they love growing in either brackish to saline waters. If we get more specific about where mangroves form, they form in the intertidal zone, so the zone that's covered by water during high tides and then exposed during low tides. Once again, they don't like the cold. We find them at lower latitudes in the tropics and subtropics. And you Unique thing about mangroves is they can expel salt. So we see a picture in the inset here of a mangrove leaf, and you can see little salt crystals. It's basically almost in a sense sweated out. They also have this really unique prop root system. We see it here in sort of the larger picture that helps it maintain its position in sediment. Remember, this is sand here, so this substrate that it's growing on is constantly moving and shifting, and allows it to sort of withstand and maintain its position while water rises and falls during tides. And it actually provides a really excellent buffering system against storm waves and even tsunami waves. Coastlines that tend to be rimmed or edged by mangrove trees or mangrove forests tend to survive tsunamis, face less destruction as a result of tsunami waves than other systems do. And because these are marine angiosperms, that means it has to reproduce via flowers and seeds. And here you have an example of some mangrove seeds on the leaves right here. This map shows the global distribution of mangrove forests. That's within the green, once again concentrated around these tropical to subtropical areas, as well as the distribution of kelp forests, in case you're wondering where kelp forests were. So these tend to dominate where mangroves don't grow. The final thing is when we're talking about these, the mangroves as well as the marine or seagrasses, remember that these are primary producers. So their goal is to take the sun's light, photosynthesize it, and produce a form of chemical energy. Both mangrove forest and seagrass meadows represent something that's known as blue carbon. These could be one of the most effective, most natural solutions for carbon capture, long-term storage of carbon on the planet. So not only do they provide primary productivity, but they also can be an important source for sinking carbon into them. For example, it's estimated the world's seagrass meadows, and these are at risk as well as many other things in the world are, can capture anywhere up to about 28 million tons of carbon each year. Those are the primary producers. Now we should move on and start talking about the primary consumers. Who eats these primary producers, who eats these autotrophs and obtains nutrition, obtains energy from them? And the first place we're going to look at is something called zooplankton. Not zooplankton, but zooplankton. So once again, these are plankton. Most of them float around in the ocean at the whim of ocean currents, but these are heterotrophs. They need to eat phytoplankton in order to live. There's a wider range of sizes within the zooplankton. They can go from 1 centimeter up to 3.5 meters in size. They eat the primary producers. These are, as I said once again, the primary consumers. So we go from the diatom to the dinoflagellate, which is then eaten by a copepod, which is an example of a zooplankton. At this point, we should pause and look at a couple other ways that we can describe plankton. We can also use the terms holoplankton and meroplankton. This represents or refers to the life cycle of plankton. So some examples, such as squid, for example, they experience different stages during their life cycle. Holoplankton are organisms that spend their entire lives as plankton. Meroplankton are organisms that spend their juvenile or larval stages of plankton. So for example, if we go back to the squid again, what you see is in their planktonic stage or in their juvenile stage, that's how they spend their life, as plankton. And then they grow up and then they become a nectonic adult, something that's capable of propelling themselves under their own power through the water. So we can have holoplankton and we can also have meroplankton. Meroplankton are an organism that only spends part of its life cycle as a plankton. Another way that we can discuss plankton is based on size. Remember that zooplankton can range in size from 1 centimeter to 3.5 meters. We can have picoplankton, so this is plankton that's very small. It actually, in fact, is smaller than 1 centimeter. And then we can have macroplankton, like this jelly here, which greatly exceeds 2 to 3 meters in size. We'll go back and visit zooplankton more in subsequent lectures, but what we're going to take a look at now is how this energy that is produced by these autotrophic primary producers, how is it transferred throughout a marine ecosystem? To do that, first of all, we have to look at a couple definitions. The first thing is the definition of what is a biotic community. And a biotic community is an assemblage of organisms, so living things that all inhabit, live together in some definable area or habitat. So for example, coral reef, for example, a kelp forest. These are all examples of a biotic community. The other term that we should be familiar with is that of ecosystem, and these are going to show up again in Module 11. So ecosystem represents the biotic plus the abiotic community, all the organisms that live within a community, plus all non-living objects such as rocks, sediment. So once again, the coral reef that is an ecosystem. What we have is all the creatures that live within the reef, the coral itself, and then we have any rock debris, any sediment that forms part of that coral reef as well. Within an ecosystem, organisms exchange energy and chemical substances. So we see this transfer and or exchange of energy and nutrients within either a biotic community or within an ecosystem. Another thing that we see within marine ecosystems is that energy flow is unidirectional. It gets passed from one level to another, up to what we call increasingly higher levels. So energy flows in one direction. We have the energy that's captured from the sun. Primary producers take it, photosynthesize, create glucose, create oxygen. They're consumed by consumers, which then in turn eventually die, and that energy is going to be released into space. So it's sort of a one-directional path, and energy continually is transferred up to higher and higher levels, from a low-level producer, from a primary producer to a low-level consumer, to up to higher and higher consumers such as whales, seals, sharks, and humans. Within this flow of energy through this living system, we see sort of three different categories of organisms. So we already kind of talked about some of them. We've talked about the primary producer. We've talked a little bit about the consumer, and then we have the decomposers as well. And each of these have a really important job to play in this flow of energy throughout the ecosystem. So the producers are autotrophs. Once again, they produce either via photosynthesis or chemosynthesis in very rare circumstances. They produce a chemical energy that then is consumed by the primary consumers and subsequent higher level consumers, second order, third order, fourth order consumers. So the consumers eat that chemical energy by eating the producer or by eating another consumer. And then we have decomposers, and the decomposers, what they do is they break down organic compounds. So if your consumer dies, the decomposer's job in there is to take this dead organism, sort of release the energy from it, look at waste products, produce waste products. And this way as well, we're losing energy out of the system, and it's returning back into sort of the overall environment, and then finally being released back into the atmosphere as heat energy. So what we can come up with is either what's called a food pyramid or a trophic or biomass pyramid. And once again, trophic just refers to the sort of the process of eating or the transfer of energy between levels. And this is a pretty typical trophic pyramid. What we see here is we see the primary producers on the bottom, and then as we move up towards the top or the apex of this trophic pyramid, we see first primary consumers, and then other secondary third level consumers, and finally sort of the top consumer. In this case here, it's either the shark or possibly even the human. This trophic pyramid is a really accurate representation of how nutrients and how energy are exchanged within the marine system. What we tend to see here are two things. We see that if we look at the lower levels, so for example, the primary consumers, the primary producers, we see that there are a lot of them and they're pretty small. But then as we move up levels on this biomass pyramid or this trophic pyramid, what we see is that the number of organisms starts to decrease, but their size starts to increase. So the less we have in an organism, for example, the shark or the mackerel, the bigger they are. The more we have of an organism, our primary consumers, such as the crustaceans, these might be some zooplankton, as well as phytoplankton, the primary producers, we see that they're much smaller and many, many more in the water. So what we see sometimes, as we'll see, is that when you have something, for example, a tuna fish sandwich, it represents thousands of other creatures whose energy has been transferred up that pyramid to produce that tuna fish sandwich. This trophic pyramid here sort of once again illustrates what I was just talking about, using the tuna fish sandwich as an example. So if we see the biomass, that massive living organism, how much there is, it has to be consumed in order to produce one tuna sandwich that you might have for lunch. For example, 10,000 kilograms are primary producers, which are then eaten by zooplankton, which are then eaten by smaller fish, mid-sized fish, and then finally the tuna. And we see that for every kilogram of tuna that might be going in to make a sandwich, roughly 10 kilograms of mid-sized fish must be consumed. For a mid-sized fish, it has to consume roughly 100 kilograms of small fish. So that sandwich that you eat represents a massive amount of energy passing up through that trophic pyramid from level to level to level. Typically what we see within this trophic pyramid is that members of an ecosystem will only be slightly larger than the food they eat. So for example, a mid-sized fish is only slightly larger than a smaller fish. That smaller fish might only be slightly larger than the zooplankton that they're eating. And that's usually what happens, but sometimes what we'll see is that there are exceptions to the rule. And one of these involves this organism that we see here kind of in orange. This is krill. Krill is a type of zooplankton, so a primary consumer. And what we see is even though they're bottom of the food chain, these tend to be fed on by some of the largest animals that have ever lived, blue whales. If you want to see a video of it, once again, there's a link at the bottom of the screen right here. So we have a blue whale here, and as I said, blue whales are one of the largest animals that have ever lived, and they skip a lot of those intermediate stages or intermediate levels of the trophic pyramid, and they go directly down and they eat the krill. And that makes up, even though they do eat some fish, that makes up the bulk of their diet. For give you an example just how big this blue whale is, if you sort of look down underneath his tail, there's a scuba diver, average human sized person right there. You can see that these are massive, massive animals.